Today I'm going to present to you some results from a national survey that was conducted to measure the U.S. public knowledge and opinions of Western free-roaming horses on our rangelands. And just, they're more commonly called wild horses. We're talking about the same thing. And let me see if I can actually get my screen to work. There we go. So for those of you that somehow aren't familiar with this, many of the wild horses on our Western rangelands are at or above carrying capacity for the herd management areas and territories where they reside. And getting them back to a sustainable level will require some difficult decisions, both economically and emotionally. Any management decision that is made is going to be more successful if it has public support. But we don't really know what management actions the public will actually support. We have a few surveys that we can look at from the past to give us some semblance of information, but that isn't really holistic. We have that first past survey, the public polling policy polling, and this was a survey conducted of 556 voters, and they asked 5 questions about their support of the mass slaughter of wild horses. Then we have a survey conducted by the American Wild Horse Campaign that asked 10 questions about the different management actions that are possible for wild horses, and they directed this towards 30 political candidates. More recently, we have a survey that came out of Australia that was looking at the public perceptions of lethal and non-lethal control options on their wild brumbies, which are the same thing as wild horses. And they found that for their management actions, people are more likely to support control options of non-native species than native species. In the last year, a master's student at Colorado State University conducted a survey that included a small survey of about 145 people looking at, again, the public's support of different management actions for wild horses. And then most recently, there was an undergraduate researcher at Utah State University that conducted a fairly lengthy survey, over 40 questions, of 842 faculty, staff, and students at Utah State University. So these 5 surveys can give us a lot of insight on where to start for a national public survey, but certainly probably couldn't be used to direct any major management actions on a regional level. So in 2019, Utah State University Extension, Utah State University Ag Experiment Station, and the University of Nevada, Reno Experiment Station got together to create what's called a W507, and it's a special committee of different experts through many universities in the West dedicated to managing or coming up with some ideas to manage wild horses. So one of the first things that we did was create a subcommittee to create a national survey, knowing that the BLM and the Forest Service and other state and federal managers, they really need to know right away what the public will support. There's a lot of fear of doing something that's going to enrage the public. And so therefore that's resulted in a lot of inaction over the last 10 years. So the subcommittee was made up of different experts, and each one was assigned 1 or 2 of the topics that you see here on the right-hand side. And we wrote 10 questions per topic. And then we brought it back to the subcommittee for review and edit it over and over again 3 different times to get it down from about 100 questions to 35 questions. So right away, you can tell that there was a lot of information we felt that we needed to know, but we really only had time to ask about 35 questions. We wanted the survey to be under 15 minutes. So we wanted to ask the questions that we felt the managers needed to know within the next year or 2. So once we had our subset of about 35 questions, we gave that survey then to the 507 committee as a whole, and they reviewed it and suggested edits. And then we gave it to Qualtrics, which was our platform for disseminating the survey. And these two teams checked the survey for bias. So whether the questions were biased, but also whether the responses were biased. For example, if we had a multiple choice question, did we provide a wide variety of possible responses? We wanted to make sure we were using common language so that anybody in any field of reference could understand what we were asking them. And again, keep that under 15 minutes. And then in the end, we had an online post-action survey. What that means is that Qualtrics administered the survey as part of an online activity that somebody was already doing. So for example, maybe a respondent was trying to get an online credit card, and at the end of the application, they would see an invitation from Qualtrics saying, if you completed this survey, you can get X bonus points on your credit card. So they administered that survey and made sure there was a quality check and a quality assurance on that until we reached a quota. And our quota was 400 respondents over the 5 regions. And you can see here that we got more than 400 respondents in most of these 5 regions. The Southwest, fell a little bit short. We think that's probably because the folks that live in the Southwest, there's a large segment of the population that's probably not doing a lot of the online activities that would get the attention of Qualtrics. But in the end, we had 3,177 respondents for the analysis that I'm going to present to you today. In addition, we had some extra funding from the experiment stations and an extension to conduct to get 1,000 respondents in Utah and 1,000 respondents in Nevada. And I'm still analyzing that data, so stay tuned for that. We also had quotas for age, income, and gender. None of the questions we asked about knowledge or opinion had any associations with age, income, or gender. So we pulled all of that information together for the rest of the analysis. We also asked what we called environmental attitude questions. So these questions were gauging the general attitude of the respondents towards natural resources in general, not just wild horses, or towards science in general. And we felt that folks going into the survey, how they felt or viewed science or natural resources would sway, in particular, their opinions of wild horse management actions. So here's just a few of the questions we asked to gauge environmental attitude. We presented this statement: using scientific research is the best way to solve environmental problems. And then did the standard Likert scale to gauge their responses. And we found that most of the respondents did feel that scientific research was the best way to solve environmental problems. We also asked some questions that really talked about how they perceive natural resources. So this statement gauged their view of a utilitarian value. So you're getting something out of the natural resources. Federally managed public lands are an important part of our nation's economy. And again, we find that most of the respondents somewhat agree or strongly agree with that statement. You'll see in these Likert scales that middle bar of neither agree or disagree. And you can expect in any survey about 20% of the respondents to have that. That would be a chi-square distribution. So anything above 20% would indicate a tendency of the respondents toward not having an opinion or an apathetic response. This next statement gauged the respondents' values of natural resources as aesthetic. So just the importance of having the natural resources as existence value. And we see that, again, most of our respondents either somewhat agree or strongly agree that public lands have an existence value, whether or not they actually get to those public lands. And then we ask them, okay, well, do you actually trust the scientists that are working for the government? And we had, again, a lot of folks that somewhat agree or strongly agree, but we did see a slight increase in the number of respondents that weren't sure if they trusted the scientists working for the US government. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the knowledge questions. So we just really wanted to know where the knowledge gaps were with the public. So be an extension, we could then outreach and try to fill those knowledge gaps in the future with some programming. We wanted to have just a baseline question, and that's just basically saying, do you know whether or not you live in a state that manages free roaming horses on public lands? And I looked at this based on the 5 regions that we categorized the United States public. And you can see that the Southeast, the Northeast, and the Midwest predominantly said no, they don't live in a state with free roaming horses. And that's true. So that's good. The folks that said yes aren't crazy or misinformed. There are a lot of national seashores on the East Coast that do have small herds of free roaming horses, and they are considered public lands. So those folks probably are correct as well. So that's okay. What's more alarming is the folks that live in the Western states that either don't know, that whopping 45% that don't know whether or not they live in a state with free roaming horses, and then the 20% that don't think they do. Almost all of our Western states have wild horses, with the exception of Washington State. So that's a little bit of a knowledge gap. Most folks should know that there are free roaming horses in their state if they live in the Western United States. So right away, we are aware of a glaring knowledge gap. If you remember, I mentioned that there was a study that came out of Australia that said that if there are non-native species, there's a greater support for those management actions. So we were curious whether or not folks understood that horses were non-native. And we found that over 30% of our respondents understood that horses were introduced to North America by European explorers and colonists. That's good. Actually, that's higher than some of us expected, but that means that there's roughly 65% of our respondents that either don't know if horses are native or have the incorrect information. So again, this is a knowledge gap that can be filled because it can influence public support for management actions on wild horses. A lot of the conflicts that we have with wild horses center around their ability to compete with native wildlife and cattle and livestock for food and water on our public lands, particularly our rangelands that are predominantly deserts and therefore have limited water resources. So we presented a couple statements about that and found that most of our respondents agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that free roaming horses compete with native wildlife, although there was an increased section of the respondents that were unsure, so they selected neither. Asked them the same statement about domestic animals such as cattle and livestock, and that agreement goes down a little bit. So a little bit fewer somewhat agree or strongly agree, and a larger proportion of the public weren't sure what the competition was between horses and domestic animals. And I should state like this, that these are the exact statements. We didn't provide them with any context or background information, which would possibly change their responses here. Horses are managed in herd management areas or herd management territories. And a lot of people, when they hear that animals are managed by the federal government, think that they're a sensitive species or they're an endangered species or some sort of special status. So we wanted to know if people understood that there's a lot of horses out there. So we asked them how many did they think they were. And less than 10% of our respondents correctly stated that there are greater than 75,000 wild horses just in our Western rangelands. And a whopping 45% of the public didn't know to the point where they didn't even want to venture to guess. So that, again, could have some implications to whether or not people are supporting management actions. If they think it's a special status species and then they hear about a roundup or some sort of reproductive control, they may be very concerned that we're going to affect a special status population. And then we ask them, okay, well, what if we have to manage wild horses, if they get overcarrying capacity, what are the legal options for the US government? Ideally, all four of these statements, euthanasia, sterilization, removal from public lands to a federal holding facility, and adoption and sale of horses from holding facilities, should be at 100%, because all four of them are actual legally available options to manage wild horse populations. So again, we are dealing with a problematic hole in the knowledge, because if they don't know that it's illegal and then they hear in the news that the BLM or the Forest Service is about to do a sterilization effort, of course they could be very alarmed that that's happening. They might feel like the government's getting away with something or compromising the horse population. And then finally, we ask them a question about common predators of free-roaming horses. I get a lot of comments or questions about, well, why is the government even managing free-roaming horses? Why can't we just let nature take its course? Or why don't we just let the predators do their thing? It shows me two things. One, that they don't understand that every other hooved mammal in the United States is managed by the state or the federal government. But it also tells me that maybe they don't understand the influence of predators on prey populations. But we asked them, well, which one of these four species is a common predator? And only 5% of our respondents correctly said that none of these is actually a common predator of free-roaming horses. You may hear in the news recently that one population of wild horses in the Devil's Garden area in California is being depredated by cougars, but this isn't common. This is one population out of 100. So all of these are wrong answers. This is, again, a concern, because if people are feeling that cougars are taking care of the horse population, then of course, when we ask them, well, what are your suggestions towards management, and give them the statement, allow nature to take its course, a large section of the respondents are going to agree with that as a management strategy, because they think that the predators are out there solving the problem. So those are the knowledge questions. And I think you guys can get the point that there's a large knowledge gap in the United States public when it comes to wild horses. So let's move on to the opinions about our management actions. So we asked some questions that are just standard management actions that have occurred or could occur in the future. So one of the things that the BLM and the Forest Service do are annually round up some of the free-roaming horses that are overcarrying capacity and put them in long-term holding facilities where they can be adopted or sold. So we asked the public about that. Do they support this as a management action? And, it's a little bit ambivalent, really. There are more of the respondents that somewhat agree or strongly agree, but it's certainly not an overwhelming support for that management action. And again, there's about 35% of the respondents that aren't sure how they feel about that management action. Then we asked the public, well, how do you feel about using contraceptives to control the number of foals born each year? So can we reduce the population of horses that way? And actually, we got a lot of support for that. Either somewhat agree or strongly agree, and very little ambivalence about that statement. So we think that most of the public would support the use of contraceptives. If we drill down on the idea of contraceptives and think, okay, well, what kind of contraceptive would you be willing to support? We asked them to rank in order of their most favorable to least favorable, and found that the physical permanent sterilization, like neutering, castration, or spaying, was the most favorable option. followed by chemical immunocontracectives like birth control. The least favorable option would be doing nothing. So by and large, the public is supportive of some sort of reproductive control to help the herds get to carrying capacity. Another option that's on the table, but is very unpopular in public opinion, or at least we feel that it's very unpopular in public opinion, is euthanasia. So we presented several statements about euthanasia and asked them whether or not they agreed or disagreed with these statements. So the first being that euthanasia should never be an option for free roaming horses. And we find that more folks somewhat agree or strongly agree with that statement than disagree with that statement. And again, we didn't provide any context. We didn't say what kind of euthanasia. We didn't say when or where. We just made the blanket statement, euthanasia. Then we said the statement, well, can it be used to reduce the population to carrying capacity? So we would go out there every once in a while and just euthanize some horses to get it to carrying capacity. And I think there's not overwhelming support for that statement. Similar numbers disagree with that as agree with that statement. We presented the statement, well, should we euthanize those horses that spend more than 5 years in a holding facility? So if nobody adopts those horses, they could spend 20 plus years in a holding facility rather than putting them on the rangeland. And we just wanted to see what people thought about that. And again, people were not in favor of euthanasia in holding facilities. And then finally, we said, well, what about euthanasia for horses that are clearly in distress, such as from starvation or dehydration or a broken leg? And by and large, the public does support euthanasia in that situation. So in general, no real support for euthanasia as a blanket statement, but if you're saying, well, we're putting down free roaming horses that are in distress, we do see public support for that. We did have one association between euthanasia and the region that the respondents came from. Oh goodness, that did not save the right way, so I'll have to help you out here. And what we found was that folks from the Northeast and the Midwest were more likely to strongly agree to euthanasia to reduce horses to carrying capacity than in the West and the Southwest. And we found that a little bit surprising, only because there are so many horses in the West, and we thought that the people that were from the West would understand the issues and maybe therefore, or have conflicts with horses directly, and would therefore be in favor of euthanasia. But that was not the case. There was a lot of other questions asked and statements presented, and I'll give you a code at the end of the talk that you can go to the website and get more information. But in the interest of time, let's move on to the environmental attitude associations. So the next few pages, I'm going to show you those. But just to give you a background on how that works, for every association, we conducted a chi-square. So for each statement, we then looked at the environmental question that we asked. And if there was an association, then we did a follow-up test, a lambda test, that indicates the strength of that association. So as you guys know, when you're doing some data analysis, sometimes you get a p-value of less than 0.05, but it doesn't actually make any relevance to the data that you're looking at. So that's what this test is doing. It's saying, okay, well, there was an association, but how relevant is that association? And it's defined as the proportionate reduction of error. So it's basically saying, well, how well does knowing X help us predict Y? And so let's look at a few of those. So we presented the statement, using scientific research is the best way to solve environmental problems. So we looked at how does that, knowing that how people respond to that statement, predict how they respond to statements about management actions. And values in the 20s are considered moderate predictors. And then anything above that, of course, is a stronger prediction. So we discovered that folks that feel that scientific research is the best way to solve environmental problems, their views on that could help us predict whether or not they agree that horses are competing with domestic livestock and cattle or native wildlife, whether they agree that the government is currently successfully managing free-roaming horse populations, and whether they would agree to use helicopters to assist with gathering free-roaming horses when we're trying to put them into holding facilities. And these are very linear associations. So the folks that strongly agree that scientific research is the best way also strongly agree that the US government's currently successfully managing. And converse, if they strongly disagree, then they're going to strongly disagree with the following statement. So it's a linear response. But we also found that this statement it has a strong support or a much better way of predicting how people feel about euthanasia and contraceptives. So even when we're looking at that statement, using contraceptives to control the number of foals born each year, it's almost 40% prediction. So we're saying that if we know how people feel about scientific research, that can help us predict, or 40% better, whether or not people will accept the idea of using contraceptives. So that's pretty astounding, really. And if you remember, we asked the public whether they agree with the statement, "I trust the scientists working for the US government." And we found that those that strongly agreed with trusting the scientists working for the US government, that can help us then predict or reduce the error of prediction up to 22% for euthanasia, 28% for roundups. So you can see here that, again, there's some moderate ability to then predict how people feel about horse management actions such as euthanasia, roundups, and whether or not horses compete with domestic livestock and cattle and native wildlife. And again, it also had a much stronger prediction value for their use of contraceptives to control the number of foals born each year, whether or not we could use helicopters to assist us with gathers, and whether or not the government is currently successfully managing free-roaming horses. As a reminder, we also then asked them questions about their views on natural resources. So here's the 3 statements that we presented about natural resources to gauge their moral value, the aesthetic value, and utilitarian value. And we found that those 3 statements, each one of those 3 statements, had the ability to moderately predict, so something in the 20s, whether or not they support the statements about euthanasia and whether they support the statements with horses competing with wildlife, but not cattle, just wildlife. So the key points that I want you to remember, and I know I presented a lot of information, were that region, age, income, and gender did not have the influence that we often expect. I think that I'm guilty, and I think everyone's kind of guilty of wanting to put the finger on people that don't agree with us. Like, well, we could get this done if only it weren't for the people in California, right? But we found that that's not true. Didn't matter whether you're male or female, you're rich or poor, old or young, or what region you came from, didn't really have an influence on their knowledge or their opinions about management actions. Most of the public doesn't know about horse ecology or horse management. So there's an opportunity there. Extension or other management agencies need to find a way to get that information out there. We can't expect the public to have an informed opinion if there's no information. That being said, most of the public is generally supportive of many of the tools that are in the toolbox. So there are ways that the BLM and the Forest Service are conducting business to try to manage wild horse herds, and the public is generally supportive of those. Trust in the science was a moderate predictor for the support of management actions. And environmental attitude was also a moderate predictor for the support of management actions. And then most importantly, I think, is that there's a section of the population that doesn't know or doesn't have an opinion, that selected that neither option on the Likert scale surveys. So we have an opportunity there to help them influence their opinion. We can let them continue to be ambivalent or apathetic, or we can help them form an opinion that's informed and based on fact, so that when management actions happen in the future, or those tough decisions have to be made, the public is capable of making an informed decision rather than reacting to some sort of sensationalist news, for example. That's all I want to present today. There's a lot more that I could present, and maybe that'll be in the future. I want to acknowledge the subcommittee participants, and then the funding sources that helped produce this survey: Utah State University Extension, USU Ag Experiment Station, and the University of Nevada Ag Experiment Station. Here's my contact information if you need to ask me any other questions that we don't get to today. There's a super long URL of where the survey results are posted as I get to them. Or there's a QR code in the bottom right-hand corner. If you scan that with your phone's camera capability, it will lead you to that website.